Good morning. Welcome to the 11:30 Dharma Talks at Columbus KTC. Columbus KTC in your own home, on your own computer. How convenient could it get, you know? So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. We are all so busy and there's so many choices of things we can do. So I want you to know that I really value your being here today to spend some time and listen to what I have to share today. So let's see. So the first thing I like to say when we do these talks is just a reminder that you're very lucky. We're very lucky to have any kind of inclination towards virtue, towards doing things to help ourselves and to benefit others. And it's worth remembering that. It's worth reminding ourselves of that. When we do things that benefit ourselves and benefit others, it's good to rejoice in those things because that reinforces positive habits. And it's positive habits that gave us this inclination for virtue in the first place. So if we want to continue to enjoy the benefits of virtuous activity and beneficial things, we need to reinforce those good habits. So it's one of the best ways of doing that is rejoicing in good things and rejoicing in virtue and rejoicing in practicing the Dharma. So that's really important. The other thing to know is that all of this is hopefully in service of your practice of the teachings. And that means both your practice on the cushion, but almost equally important is your practice off the cushion, because these teachings and the Buddhist path, the path of Dharma, is an experiential path. It's something that we can talk about and learn about, but it's really ultimately experienced, and realization is experienced, not learned. So that's an important thing to know. It looks like people are watching, but I feel like I should ask somebody to say hi in the chat just to make sure we're good. But so if someone would do that, I'd appreciate it. But back to the point, the Tibetan word for that we frequently translate as meditation is gom, and that the meaning of gom is actually much closer to like familiarize or get to know better. So thank you. Thank you, Kala. So that word means to get to know better. So when we say meditate, when we translate gom as meditate, we're really talking about getting to know our mind better. And the idea being that like who we really are and what we really are and the boundless potential that we have frequently goes unrecognized by us. And so we need to get to know it better. And as we become more familiar with our minds, that's how we begin to reveal that potential. So studying the Dharma, studying the teachings of the Buddha and other enlightened masters can help us get a conceptual idea of our true nature, but realizing that nature happens only through experience, through applying these teachings and living them beyond concepts, experience. So the incredibly skillful means that help us cultivate experience, which we're so fortunate to be in contact with, our meditation. Really, like that's the best. That's the reason we meditate, is to cultivate these experiences. And so the best way to familiarize, particularly at a teaching like this, where we are going to rely on concepts for the next roughly an hour. So the best way to do that right now would be to listen. So there's this setup called the three trainings, and they are listening, contemplation, and meditation. So in a teaching, the best thing to do is to listen. That's the most beneficial way that you can benefit from this session. So listening would be being open to new information, and that means just kind of listening, being open, kind of what it sounds like, accepting. And that's important now. But then the next step, contemplation, is important afterwards. So that you'll get the most out of the session is afterwards you think about it, and you test it and you question it. And the reason this is an important distinction is because I think our normal habit is to try to listen and contemplate at the same time, which means we're not fully listening and we're not fully contemplating. So the best thing to do is kind of just to be open, even if you don't agree with things I'm saying or you doubt them, that's fine, but you'll have time to think about it later, and you'll get the most out of it if we listen now, contemplate later. And then the third part being the meditation, simply doing the practices that cultivate this experience. So let's give it a shot real quick. So I just said listening is a great thing to do, and then we contemplate and then we meditate. So let's take a second to contemplate that. Makes some sense to me. Hopefully you too. And then let's just take a couple of minutes and place our attention on the breath, and we'll meditate for a second. And then we'll do the refuge prayer and begin. So let's just take just a minute or so and just rest our attention on the breath. And if our attention wanders, just bring it back to the breath, and we'll just kind of be here for a minute. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to put the refuge prayer up on the screen. Get my name off of the screen. And let's say the refuge prayer 3 times in English. Until I reach enlightenment, I take refuge in all the Buddhas and in the Dharma and in the noble Sangha. By the merit of accomplishing the 6 perfections, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Until I reach enlightenment, I take refuge in all the Buddhas and in the Dharma and in the noble Sangha. By the merit of accomplishing the 6 perfections, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Until I reach enlightenment, I take refuge in all the Buddhas and in the Dharma and all the noble Sangha. By the merit of accomplishing the 6 perfections, may I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then I'll say my own prayer briefly. Alden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Dagi Jiwo Bede Denjula Kadrin Chimpo Gone Jizunte Kusun Togi Nyujup Saldu So. Okay, thank you. So today's talk was titled Finding Our Learning Zone, Middle Way Day to Day. This has been a fun process for me, learning these, how to give a teaching like this, how to plan it and how to research it and stuff like that. It's kind of like, to me, I'm finding it's kind of like a documentary. Documentaries are always like about a thing, ostensibly, and then you get into the documentary and you find out it's about something else, like maybe it's about the relationship between the people, or it's about the culture, or the impact of consumerism or something, like there's always some other theme, that's different from what it seems to be about, and so it's been a fun journey, because this is one of those talks for sure that started out as one thing and ended up sort of as another. So being kind of new at this, I've found it really helpful when I give a talk like this to determine three kind of main themes. I've heard it's best to keep talks like this to three major ideas. And that seems to help me as well in not rambling off too much, where I can get into trouble. So we've already talked about one of the main themes today, which is familiarization, becoming familiar. And the other two are going to be safety in terms of kind of actual safety, but maybe more applicably like effectiveness, like practicing effectively, doing things in a way that we can be sure they're benefiting us, that they're of benefit rather than detriment. And then the third will be learning, in the sense of consciously putting ourselves in a state of improvement and growth by challenging ourselves. So let's begin to look a little bit at the middle way and what that means, what we're talking about when we say the middle way. The most traditional way of teaching this is really the life of the Buddha, talking about, in brief, talking about the way he was born into a royal family, lived this life of luxury and royalty in the castle, had a type of existence that was curated for him to not meet with suffering and for him to not meet with things that would make him think about impermanence or illness or death. Like his environment was arranged so that he would hopefully not have to come into contact with those things. Even in that scenario, he still found himself unhappy, and through a series of events, decided to leave that environment, to leave the castle, and he renounced that lifestyle and went into the woods and practiced asceticism, which was the other extreme. Like now, where he was immersed completely in comforts, he decided to leave and immerse himself completely in. Oops, let me get rid of that prayer. I had my notes up on the screen, so you didn't see it. Sorry about that. So he went to the opposite extreme. Now he's practicing self-mortification. Eating very little, becoming emaciated, living in the woods. And so he's at this other extreme, and he also didn't find happiness. And so this is how he came to discover the middle way, which is one of the ways that we describe the teachings of the Buddha. And a common analogy for this middle way is that of like a guitar string or a musical instrument string. The idea being when you tune a string, if it's too loose, it won't sound at all. And if it's too tight, it can break. So tuning an instrument, tuning a string, you need to get it to just the right tightness, the right balance between loose and tight. And the way we see this in the life of the Buddha, in the story that the brief account I just gave, is these extremes between indulgence and renunciation, or comfort and self-denial. So the more philosophical academic terms would be like materialism and nihilism. Like all the material stuff around us, our body, all of that stuff really matters. End of story. Or none of this stuff really matters. So that's the traditional view of how we talk about the middle way. I'm following the chat. So everybody's getting static. I can change my mic too. See if that makes a difference. Let's see if I can go from different route here. Go to the pods. Thanks for letting me know. How about this? They get any better? that sound better, folks? I switched to the earbuds. Yes. Good. All right. Well, Yeti, you're out of here. So, okay. Yeah, thank you guys for letting me know that. It is kind of tough not seeing faces. I really wish like I could see faces. I miss you guys, but we'll do that soon. So, so we were just talking about the traditional description of the middle way. Now, to give some background again on, like I said, this talk didn't end up where I thought it would. Um, where this actually, where they got the I got the inspiration for this was I was looking into a book called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. This is it. It's by an author named David Trelevin. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Um, the idea being here that I wanted to look into potential negative effects of meditation. And this is something that is actually getting a good bit of research now. And mindfulness meditation, the basic meditation that we learn, is has been taught for millennia now, and it's been around for a long time. And but it I don't know that it's ever taken into account situations of like trauma, people who are surviving trauma. And trauma is a lot more common than we might realize. Like I've seen figures that like 90% of the global population will experience a trauma at some point in their life. And so many of us have, and it's not necessarily the case then that you carry that forever. It becomes an issue of can you integrate that experience into your life, And at any given time, I've seen that like maybe 1 in 10 people have unintegrated traumas, that they're going through. So so I mean, it's almost certain that someone who is listening to or seeing this talk at some point will be going through that type of situation. And as people who practice meditation, and particularly for people who teach meditation, this is something really important to think about because the normal instruction for mindfulness, shamatha meditation, our foundational meditation, is to just sit like kind of like we did at the beginning, place the attention on the breath. And then when we notice thinking, we bring our attention back to the breath. And we just kind of keep at that, and sometimes our mind's busy and sometimes our mind's a little foggy, and that's okay. And that's all safe for us, generally speaking. But sometimes if we have unintegrated traumas, the thoughts that come up and placing ourselves in that format of practice can actually do more damage than good and can serve to re-traumatize people. So I want to be clear that I'm not giving a talk on psychology today, and this is something that I do want to talk about more and look into. I want to look at it in terms of because what I realized as I was going through this book, and full disclosure, I started this book, read about halfway through it, put it down for like a couple months, came back, realized that I was probably not going to do the talk about this book. But what I really wanted to do is I realized as I'm looking at the modifications that are there for people in this situation, that they are like existing practices we have in the Karma Kadyu lineage. So that's one thing I want to look at later on is how these modifications actually track with Kagyu practices so that we can be aware of this, be trauma sensitive, but also, use these practices that already exist within our lineage. So that's something I want to take a look at. So this is not a talk about psychology, and this is not a talk specifically about what to do if you are surviving a trauma. Like it is important if you are finding yourself dysregulated, like moving between hyper arousal or dullness, like dissociation, things like that. Those type of things. It's important to talk to a clinician about that stuff, um, because our frequent instruction about just keep at it and or it will work, and this will work out for you, is true for most people who aren't, but people who are not in that situation of dealing with an unintegrated trauma. So this talk is more for the genuine, the genuine. I'm sorry, not the genuine, the general population. So, but it relates to this, and what I got from what really kind of spurred what this talk is now, this like finding the middle way thing, was this concept of finding a window of tolerance. And that window of tolerance in the trauma sensitive mindfulness field has to do with finding our space between that hyper arousal and hypo arousal, and finding that space where we're safe, where it's safe for us to do this practice, where we're not straying into kind of dangerous territory for us. Now, and actually, I want to read real quick his the definition in here of hypo and hyper arousal, because I think it tracks pretty interestingly with some traditional teachings. So just to give some perspective on this window of tolerance and where it comes from here in this trauma sensitive mindfulness field, he says, when we're hyper aroused, there's too much energy in the system. We can be plagued by intrusive thoughts, are anxious and easily overwhelmed, and can find it hard to relax or focus. Then he says, when hypo aroused, we experience a lack of energy that leads to an absence of sensation, a lack of concentration, and a sense of immobility. People report feeling passive, disinterested, unmotivated, and numb. And then, so for those working to integrate traumas, starting to be aware when we go into those states of hyperarousal and hypoarousal, that just the awareness, the familiarity with that can be a very empowering thing, and it can help them to begin to self-monitor and serve to normalize their experience. Now, for most of us, it may not be dangerous if we're feeling one or other of those extremes. And what I'd like to do is draw a little parallel between those descriptions and the primary defects in shamatha as they're described in Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche's book, Excellent in the Beginning. And he describes them as torpor and excitement. And torpor occurs in meditation when you find that your body starts to feel weak, as if you could not even move if you wanted to. Your mind also starts to feel unclear without any kind of perky clarity. You might actually fall asleep at this point, but even if you do not fall asleep, your mind is dull. You may not be particularly disturbed by thoughts, and your mind may be fairly stable, but it is stable in a dull, sleepy way. As long as you remain in this state of torpor, you will not receive any benefit from shamatha practice. The second defect is excitement. This can manifest as the arising of thoughts related to the kleshas, such as attachment or anger, or it can be some kind of attraction or irritation about the external environment. In either case, the problem with excitement is that it prevents you from settling your mind on the chosen object or technique. Often this happens in the following way. A mental affliction arises which causes you to direct your attention to an external object. You become so involved with that object or sense perception that you cannot bring yourself back to the technique, even when you recognize that you have become distracted. So you can see there's a similarity to these things. And depending on where we're coming from and where our personal situation is, those extremes, if we're dealing with an unintegrated trauma, those situations can be actually be damaging. But even if we're not, they're not productive, and they're situations that we need to be aware of because we need to correct them. We need to get back to that window where we're actually benefiting from the practice. So the antidotes that Rinpoche gave for those defects in the practice of shamatha are for torpor or dullness, to begin to sort of tighten up, like literally physically tighten up a bit, and to bring our vision up, and sort of have this feeling of everything coming up. And that would be the antidote to work with when we find ourselves in a situation of torpor. That word just sounds so funny, doesn't it? I got to think of see if there's a better synonym for that word, torpor. And then excitement is the opposite of that. And so in excitement, what we do is we bring everything downwards. So we bring the gaze lower. We maybe bend down a little bit, even have the sense of everything coming down. And in a very practical way, like for me, when I'm practicing, like sometimes it's really just like a little adjustment of the gaze, just slightly lower, from where I'm looking in front of me, and it can make a big difference. You can if you need it, you can do more. You might just move your gaze a little bit, and that's not enough. And then you may tighten yourself up a little bit, and then you may raise your gaze a little more. So you can do this in degrees, but those would be the antidotes for those situations. Um, so as I mentioned earlier, meditation actually translates as familiarizing. And the first step is really just developing an awareness of when we become too excited or too dull, and becoming familiar with what those states feel like for us, and then being able to label them as such. Likewise, we become familiar with our window of tolerance, where we're actually practicing safely and effectively. Then this is a necessary prerequisite to applying any of the antidotes that we talked about to these extremes. If we don't know that we're out of our window, we won't know when to apply the antidote. So we have to familiarize ourselves with our window of tolerance. And we have to remember that that window can also change, day to day and moment to moment. Some days we may be a little grumpy. Some days we didn't maybe get enough sleep or drink enough water. And some days we may actually be in such a good mood that things that might normally distract us don't. They just roll off our backs. So maybe that window is larger some days too, not just smaller. And because we know that meditation means to familiarize, then this also applies to our post meditation. And as I said earlier, formal practice, on the cushion practice is important, but off the cushion practice is equally important. And off the cushion practice, what we do throughout our day, that's the bulk of our practice when you think about it, because most of us aren't spending the majority of our day formally practicing. So I remember the first Dharma talk I ever heard, somebody used the analogy of like painting a painting, and if you spend 20 minutes in the morning, painting the painting, what are you doing with the rest of the day? Are you erasing what you painted, or are you working to preserve it, or still add on to that painting, So it's kind of like that with meditation. Is what we're doing during the day supporting our on the cushion practice or not? So as we said, meditation means to familiarize. So this applies to our post meditation, on the cushion and off the cushion. So what we do throughout our day matters, and this window of tolerance matters throughout our day too. Like this awareness we can cultivate of whether we're feeling too excited to practice beneficially or feeling too dull to practice beneficially, and trying to apply some kind of antidote is important off the cushion too. So we have to watch where our window is, and it's good to know our window, where the middle is, between excitement and torpor. And so now that's kind of a way. The reason we talked about that is because that's a way to know when we're in an effective state of practice, when we're practicing safely, and that's essential. Otherwise, and this is a matter of safety, literally for some people, but for all of us, certainly, it's definitely a matter of not wasting time, or hurting ourselves. So this is an important middle way to be aware of and to think about and to cultivate. And as I said a little bit earlier too, it also normalizes our experience. It also normalizes the idea that we will move between these extremes, and we will, our experience is in motion. We are our process. So it's good to know that, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit here too. So let's look at another set of extremes and another perspective on the middle way. And this, some of you will recognize this because we did a book study last winter, I guess. Yeah, myself and Lama Mitchell from Mississippi did a book study on Pema Chodron's Welcoming the Unwelcome, And there's a chapter in that book called Beyond the Comfort Zone. And that's where I got the finding our learning zone idea. And she begins this chapter by talking about refuge and the idea of thinking about what it is that we actually take refuge in. People who are here and practicing Buddhism will be familiar with the concept of refuge. But for those who aren't, what we're talking about here is where we go for protection, to feel comfortable, to feel safe. Like the most we could think of an umbrella actually as a form of refuge from the rain. If we don't want to get wet, we get an umbrella, and that's our refuge from the rain. But one of the prime practices in Buddhism is taking refuge, and this is more than just a prayer, like we said in the beginning. Um, the prayer part is important, but the idea is that throughout our day we're engaged in a practice of refuge taking, um, whether we know it or not. And so, like a lot of things, when we talk about enlightenment, or awakening is another way to talk about that. Waking up, we want to wake up to what we're doing, wake up to our habits, wake up to what inertia we're putting into motion, what we're feeding. There's that analogy about like which wolf are you feeding, like is it the good one or the bad one, so it's good to know, what we're doing, to be awake to that kind of stuff. So um what is it that we're seeking refuge in? We say, if we're Buddhist practitioners, we say we're seeking refuge in the three jewels, as the Buddha as the teacher, the Dharma as the teaching, and the Sangha as the community who can support us on that path. But is that really what we're doing throughout the whole of our day? I mean, we may do that in the morning when we do our three prostrations and open the shrine and things like that. But it's good to check in and figure out, is this what we're doing the rest of the time? Where are we actually seeking refuge? And to be aware when we are taking refuge in places that are not the three jewels. And she mentions a teacher who recommends. I'm not necessarily recommending this practice, but I guess I see the value in this. There's a teacher she just talks about who recommends when we do things like taking refuge in Netflix or our refrigerator or or a nap, um, treating that like we would our actual refuge prayer in the three jewels, and actually putting our palms together and saying, "I take refuge in Netflix." Not because that's what we want to do, but because it's what we're doing, and that's realistic look at it, and I think, probably since this talk is about the middle way, that I'm not saying we can't have our comforts, I'm just saying like we need to find the middle way between these two. And in order to do that, we need to know the extremes. We need to know when we're doing things, by the book, so to speak, like in a dharmic way, with non-attachment, or when we're doing things based on attachment. So um, I want to get another graphic up here. And this is from Pema Chodron's book. And this is her diagram of the learning zone. So this is what we're going to talk about here for a minute. And what we see is in the middle here is the comfort zone. And so the comfort zone here is where we go for comfort. What are the things we do to make us feel comfortable? Um, I mentioned some examples, maybe it's food, maybe it's Netflix, maybe it's reading, like there's any number of things that make us feel safe and comfortable. So, yeah, morning caffeinated tea. For me, it's Grady's cold brew. But yeah, I feel that. So it's good to know where our comfort zone is, what it is we're most attracted to. Um, then in the middle, or the next circle out, would be our learning zone. And this learning zone is where we stretch beyond our comfort zone. So she uses an example of like stinginess. So for instance, if we are kind of stingy and we feel secure and comfortable by not sharing things, Maybe we get into our learning zone by making a small donation to some charity, or if somebody comes over and we have like a couple small Buddha statues or something, and they see one they like, and we have several of them, we give them one, and it may not be completely comfortable for us to do that, but it pushes us into this learning zone. And so you basically make an effort to challenge yourself a little bit in the learning zone. And then the outer zone here, she calls the excessive risk zone. And she says here, if you force yourself to be in this outer zone, you'll be too traumatized to learn anything. So this is like the deep end of the swimming pool when you don't know how to swim. And that's the excessive risk zone. And these zones are personal to all of us. We're all different. What our comfort zone looks like is different for each of us, and the size of our comfort zone is different for each of us. What our learning zone is like is different for each of us. Our excessive risk zone is different for each of us. And again, like our window of tolerance, these zones can shift and change. So being aware and checking in with these things, with ourselves on these topics, is important. So keep this in your head. I'm going to take this off the screen. There's the beyond the comfort zone diagram. We're going to be talking about the learning zone in particular. So the more we can step out of our comfort zone, this is what's kind of ironic. The more that we step out of our comfort zone, the more comfortable we become in life. Because, as many of you may have noticed, the world is not designed for our perfect comfort 24/7. Although we tend to think it is, and when we're met with things that don't perfectly align with our comfort zone, we're shocked and offended, and upset and hurt, and we think our day's gone down the toilet. So I mean, that's kind of the way we approach the whole world. Is we know our comfort zone, but then when things don't fit we're like surprised. We're shocked by this. So that's why it's important that we try to get into this learning zone, because really, when we stay in that comfort zone all the time, the ironic thing is that it shrinks. That comfort zone gets smaller and smaller the more we stay in there, and we get more and more set in our ways. So, Pema Chodron says, in the context of refuge, it's helpful to keep these zones in mind and to notice our orientation, where we're oriented. So, sometimes we do need to be in our comfort zone. Sometimes we do need to get back into that comfort zone. And we need to honor that, she says. When those times come and we're thinking clearly about it, sometimes we need to get into our comfort zone. But many times when we think we need that comfort zone, we're really just kind of kidding ourselves. We don't, and actually, like, we may actually benefit and come to even enjoy spending some time in that learning zone. So this is important because happiness and comfort are temporary. And she uses the example of Shantideva's quote that happiness is like a dewdrop on a blade of grass. It's there, you see it, it's gorgeous, and it's going to go. So that's what our comfort is like. So when we try to cling to that comfort zone and think that it's permanent, it is inevitable that attachment will cause us suffering. So love is a good example of this, she says, which is like the idea of having the honeymoon period. And then after that period of time, it's really kind of all learning zone, I think, for the most part, or at least a whole lot of learning zone. So, so this idea of happiness disappearing shouldn't be depressing. It should actually be something that points us towards the way out of suffering. And I want to read one of the paragraphs from this chapter. She says, the idea of happiness disappearing like a dewdrop could sound depressing, but Togme Zangpo's intention here is to point us to freedom. Oh, yeah, I said Shani Deva, but this is the 37 practices of Bodhisattva, Togme Zampo. So to start again, the idea of happiness disappearing like a dewdrop could sound depressing, but Togme Zampo's intention here is to point us to freedom. Clinging to things that are always changing is a comfort zone tactic. It's what keeps us in samsara, which is a Sanskrit word referring to the vicious cycle we're all trapped in because we continually resist reality. The only way to free ourselves from samsara is to awaken to the open-endedness of how things are. This requires venturing out into the learning zone, where we will encounter fundamental groundlessness. Trungpa Rinpoche equates this state with the wide open space of our basic goodness. It is the fresh air of our deepest sanity. But because this space doesn't give us much to hang on to, we usually find it intimidating. This is when, in Trungpa Rinpoche's poetic description, we tend to, quote, hide ourselves in caves and jungles, unquote, which is a way of saying we become very self-involved. We kindle a great fire of hatred, roil the river of lust, and wallow in the mud of laziness. Aggression, passion, and ignorance, what are known as the three poisons, are the result of not connecting with our basic goodness because we fear the groundless state. So, how do we cultivate this learning zone? The way that Pema Chodron suggests is Tonglen, the practice of taking and sending. On the cushion, Tonglen really is learning zone stuff, sitting down and breathing in suffering and discomfort and breathing out love and happiness. That is a practice, of working in our learning zone. What we do off the cushion, when we encounter something that's outside of our comfort zone, instead of avoiding it, we can try breathing it in. We don't want to get into our excessive risk zone, so we need to watch and make sure that we're in our window of tolerance. And that's where that first idea, that window of tolerance, becomes important, because that is what can tell us when we've left the learning zone, and entered the excessive risk zone. Because we may notice that our attempts at learning in the learning zone are actually causing a great deal of agitation or excitement, or stress. Or maybe we're in the excessive risk zone, and the way we're reacting to that is we're just kind of disconnecting and becoming apathetic and withdrawn. So the window of tolerance is a good way of knowing when it's okay to stay in that comfort zone when we're there. And so when we do this practice off the cushion, when we work with learning zone off the cushion, we can use something small, any small disappointment. And our day is rife with those, right? Whether it's having to wait in line somewhere longer than you hoped, or you go to your fridge and one of your kids ate your favorite snack you were saving for later. There's all these little things that tend to upset us, or tend to set us, into the three poisons of anger, attachment, or ignorance. So when we come across these little disappointments, that's our opportunity to work with the learning zone. And instead of fighting it off, or trying to run away from it, we actually sit with that disappointment for a minute and we breathe it in. And what Pema Chodron says about that is just by choosing to do Tonglen in these situations, instead of losing heart or acting out, you're stepping out of your comfort zone. You're beginning to make friends with your own pain and to develop empathy with the human condition.
Even though you're working with a relatively minor suffering, you're building the strength and capacity to handle something greater. If you keep doing this, you'll find that in great adversity, that strength will be available to you. So we have to train, we have to work on this stuff. We have to do the exercises that will put in place the skills that we need in larger, more dramatic situations. So thinking of the learning zone in terms of a general approach to Dharma, it it benefits us to be familiar with where our learning zone is at any given point in time, because we may be becoming too attached. And remember, attachment is the cause of suffering, according to the Buddha. Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. This is kind of an interesting thing, right? The Buddha discovered the middle way, and then his first teaching was the Four Noble Truths. And so he taught that suffering is a part of life. Suffering, in this case, being like discontentment, dissatisfaction. Um, and then he taught that suffering has a cause, and the cause of suffering is attachment. And and then I can't. Thank you for asking, though. That would be fun. I don't have actually. A good question about the bass was just given, and I rarely play it, and I only have headphones for it. I don't even have an amp anymore, so I'm kind of not legit with the bass anymore. But so the Buddha taught the truth of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. That suffering has a cause, and that cause is attachment, and that if the attachment, the cause of suffering is removed, we can achieve the cessation of suffering, and that there is a path to achieve the cessation of suffering. So attachment can be to stuff, but it also can be to extremes. It can be attachment to one end of the spectrum. Um, and so it's important to know this. Um, it's important to know where our learning zone is, because we may be straying to one of the extremes. We may be straying to the comfort zone, or we may be straying to the extreme risk zone. And what that means, I think, sometimes is, for instance, maybe we're feeling like, I think this is maybe the most common, is we think we're falling short of what a Buddha should be like, or we're falling short of what we've heard the perfect practice of Dharma is. We've behaved in a way that's not ideal. It's not the way we wanted to behave. And we're hard on ourselves because of it. Um, or maybe we have found that we can't live up to those things, that we tend to fail. And so maybe we go to this extreme of, well, I just, this stuff doesn't matter. I'm just going to do what I want. And I believe in the Buddha, and that's great, but, I can't keep up with all these rules. And so you give them up altogether, and then you've strayed into the comfort zone. So in general, knowing our learning zone is important, because it will allow us to be compassionate to ourselves. Um, and this is where I want to bring it back around to the life of the Buddha, the ideas of indulgence and renunciation, that classic formulation of the middle way. It's common for us to go through periods of generating like too much attachment to our own comfort, or too much attachment to like overly rigid practice. And our Dharma practice should take place in the learning zone. We need to know when we're taking things too easy, or when we're taking them too hard. As noble as the Four Truths are, if we're attached to them, I mean, how ironic, right? that knowing the Four Noble Truths, and that suffering is the cause of attachment, we can also become attached to the Four Noble Truths. So if we're being too hard on ourselves, we're being too lazy, or not perfectly living up to the ideals of conduct, not being quote unquote good Buddhist, we may be keeping ourselves in the excessive risk zone, and we're not benefiting ourselves or others. So rather than continue to push ourselves beyond our abilities, and in fact cause more damage than good, it may actually be time to recognize that we need to find the middle again. That even though our intentions are good, and the Dharma is good, and we're strong and motivated people, until we're fully enlightened, we're always going to have our own limitations. And the Bodhisattva vow that many of us have taken does not say, I will behave exactly like a Bodhisattva henceforth and forevermore. What it says is, just as Buddhas of the past gave rise to the mind of awakening and trained gradually in the stages of the training of a Bodhisattva, in the same way, for the benefit of beings, I too will generate this mind of awakening and will train in the proper stages in the trainings of a Bodhisattva. So this is important to remember, because while it is important for us to know our potential, to be familiar with enlightenment, awakening, practicing the Dharma properly must also include familiarizing ourselves with our seeming limitations and finding the middle way between perfect Buddhahood and where we are right now. We're able to safely and effectively learn to traverse the path towards awakening. So I hope that there were some useful things in this talk for you today. Again, thank you for your time. If there's any questions, we have like 8 minutes left, so I'm happy to take an attempt at any questions. If not, totally sit for a little while. I'm not seeing anything, so I guess I'll say we are getting closer and closer to opening the center, and or at least to having, I should say, having the building. And we still have quite a bit to do. There's funds still to be raised. So if you are so moved, I've put the link to donate to support the rebuilding of KTC here in the bottom of the screen. And so feel free to make a donation if you'd like. And thank you all. My email, I'll put it in the chat. I'm Adam at ColumbusKTC.org. I'm glad this was helpful for you guys. Thank you very much. So I'll say that, thank you. So I try my best to stick to what I've learned from my teachers, and getting into the psychology stuff was definitely a little scary. That's why I wanted to try to bring it into our tradition and relate it to things that we talk about. So I want to say that if there's anything today that confused anyone or was incorrect, that is my own error. I'm just doing my best to try to share these incredible teachings that I'm so lucky to have come into contact with. So I confess any errors in this presentation today, and I hope that that I've given everyone something useful. And if something wasn't useful or rubbed you the wrong way, leave it behind. So I rejoice in all the great works of our teachers. I hope that they remain and continue to teach the Dharma. Thank you all for being here. Good luck with your practice. Let's dedicate the merit of this session to the benefit of all sentient beings. We pray that all beings are able to remain in their window of tolerance, to know their window of tolerance so they can do so. And may we all stay in that learning zone as much as possible, because that's where we make our real progress. So we dedicate this merit for the benefit of all sentient beings. All right, thank you, everybody. Take care.